Thank you, Monica. That's very kind. Do you think we could get this horrible picture of me turned off? I can't stand it looking at myself.
Because, I deserve my government check. Those people don't.
But it all works out better in the end. People pay higher taxes, but...
So let me tell you a little about myself. I set out years ago to be a historian, and then what I wound up doing as the years passed was starting a literary magazine, working as a columnist for newspapers. I wrote a whole bunch of books. I took on all kinds of subjects like rock music, the advertising industry, the stock market, the conservative movement, and of course, the culture wars. But as I look back over my career, I realize now that everything I have written on whatever far-flung aspect of life has always been about one big subject. What the hell happened to this country? Now, by asking that, I don't mean to invoke nostalgia of the Ronald Reagan kind, in which we're supposed to pine for the, small-minded, tight-fisted America where it was every man for himself and everybody knew that they were entitled to not a goddamn thing. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean the opposite. What happened to the affluent society I was born in? The America whose proudest boast was that everyone here could afford a car, a fridge, a TV, that we were wiping out poverty and prejudice and disease, that ours was a country where all citizens, black and white, school teachers, farmers, trash collectors, were either now or one day soon going to be members of the great middle class. Not so long ago, historians used to think of the rise of that middle class society as our one big story, our triumphant narrative. Americans knew who this country existed for back then. Universal prosperity is what defined us as a people. This was the glowing, incandescent, capital R, reason that our leaders would give to the world to sign up for our side in the Cold War rather than sign up with the communists. Well, folks, the big story of our lifetimes is how that beloved community got torn apart. How we turned our back on those ideals, how we liquidated that affluent society so that we might sluice the proceeds into some CEO's bank account. Before I came over here, I got an email from a friend of mine drawing my attention to a brand new study by the United Nations in which it turns out that America is no longer a developed nation by a certain bunch of economic standards, mainly inequality. And folks, this is what I think about every time I open up the laptop and start typing. And that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. How did all of that get taken away from us? Who were the perpetrators of this colossal act of vandalism? What were the reasons they gave as they jackhammered it all apart? And most importantly, why in heaven's name don't we do something about it? Every year, folks, we heap up more of what makes life worth living at the feet of a handful of very rich men. I mean, it is an outrage. Where are our leaders? Why doesn't some enterprising politician take action? These are the great mysteries of recent history. These are the inescapable questions of our time. Folks, I was born in Kansas City in the year 1965, in the middle of what President Lyndon Johnson called the greatest upward surge of economic well-being in the history of any nation. American GNP grew by 6.5% that year, and the official stated goal of American economic policy was a growing abundance widely shared. In Washington, the president was signing his name to an astonishing series of reforms. the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the War on Poverty, the Food Stamp Act, the Appalachian Development Authority, the Housing and Urban Development Act, the Higher Education Act, the Highway Beautification Act, and on and on and on. In July of 1965, the president actually flew to Kansas City in order to sign into law the Medicare bill, the crowning achievement of his Great Society agenda. And it was a time of soaring optimism for Americans, at least for Americans in the industrial northern states. And they rode what they called the Carousel of Progress at the New York World's Fair that year, and accepted what the American Pavilion called the challenge to greatness. Now, as we all know, here in this room, the Great Society never really lived up to its stated ideals. 1965 was also the year of the Watts riots, the first of the big city uprisings of that decade. Eve of Destruction was a #1 hit song. And America sent its first big detachment of combat troops to Vietnam, and protests and teach-ins followed on campuses all over America. Indeed, in 1968, Martin Luther King spoke right here in Manhattan and pointed out that, this is a quote from his speech, "Our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. As long as justice is postponed, we will be on the verge of social destruction." But broadly speaking, the direction in which this country was traveling in those days was toward inclusive affluence, toward the vast plateau of the universal middle class, where the main difference between white collar and blue collar were tastes and manners, not income. And folks, this was not just well known in those days, this was a cliche. Some statistics. About 30% of the private sector workforce belonged to a union in 1965. There were 268 major strikes that year. The price tag for a year at the University of California was less than $1,000. For California residents, it was free. Student loan debt was too insignificant to measure. Taxes, of course, were high in those days. The Justice Department filed dozens of big antitrust suits, and the richest man in the world was oil billionaire J. Paul Getty, whose net worth was a little bit over $1 billion, and who loved to complain about how unsatisfying it was to be rich, since even the middle-class man now had access to what once had been the exclusive privileges of great wealth. In 2021, last year, the founder of Facebook made an estimated $24 billion in just 1 year. The founder of Google made $47 billion, again, just 1 year. The founder of Amazon launched himself into space, because that's who our astronauts are nowadays, right? They're billionaires. He launched himself into space, and then he thanked his employees who, quote, paid for all this, presumably by all the work they did for lousy compensation. Taxes on the top brackets were low in 2021. Unionization in the private sector was at 6%. There were only 16 major strikes. And in 2016, the last year of the last Democratic administration, the Justice Department filed only one big antitrust suit. In 2021, Americans spent 5 times as much on prescription drugs as they did in 1965, and yet American life expectancy was spiraling downward, thanks in part to, of course, the COVID epidemic, but also to the wave of suicides, alcoholism, and opioid overdoses, the so-called deaths of despair that were sweeping the devastated zones of the formerly industrial northern states. Of course, there's all sorts of ways that progress continues in this country, and I don't mean to slight them. Gay marriage is legal now. There are women on the Supreme Court. We've had a black president, and the boardrooms of this country are no longer the exclusive province of white men. Lyndon Johnson would be pleased. But on this central question of who owns, who works and who gets what, this country is going in reverse. I mean, you guys know this. Hourly wages grow just ever so slightly while CEO compensation soars. The bottom 90% of the population sees little improvement in their situation, whether it's good times or bad. Even when unemployment is low, nothing changes for them because about 84% of new jobs in the private sector are 84% of new jobs are in the service sector, by which I mean the kind of jobs that are notorious for bad pay and not enough hours. Manufacturing, meanwhile, has cratered since the year 2000. Complaints about unaffordable housing, about student loan debt, about medical bankruptcy are so commonplace these days that I actually read about them in this week's copy of Time magazine. Now, you drive through any small town in my part of America, by which I mean Kansas and Missouri, and you will see what decades of middle-class decline looks like. A lot of empty storefronts built during some long-forgotten boom, their paint peeling, and their windows covered with decaying plywood. You'll see defunct banks, derelict drugstores, closed down diners, a whole lot of thrift stores housed in what used to be hardware or florist shops. A lot of, faded, jaunty slogans from a distant, optimistic, almost incomprehensible time. Relics of a civilization that doesn't make sense anymore. Meanwhile, in our country's creative class neighborhoods, the places where people have a lot of professional degrees and where businesses aren't going to be wrecked by foreign competition, even the pandemic was no big deal. People just transitioned to working from home, ordering what they needed on Amazon and watching as their assets ballooned in the latest bull market. For the enlightened and the fortunate, these last few decades have been an endless summer of prosperity and righteousness. But for people in the deindustrialized cities and the ruined towns and the service sector jobs, America doesn't even pretend to have an answer. Maybe payday loans. Maybe you can go out there and speculate in Bitcoin. Folks, what I am talking about here is nothing less than the undoing of a civilization. We never voted for any of this, but it happened nevertheless. And today this country is organized to prosper only the people on top, not to ensure the well-being of people like us. Now, as Hank showed you with these books, people have been ringing the alarm bells about this for a long time, about the downfall of the affluent society. And if you're as old as me, you're kind of tired of hearing about it. Not because it's untrue, but because nothing is ever done about it, and it just gets worse every year. I mean, we learn these days about how the top 3 individual Americans own as much wealth as the entire bottom half of society. 3 people. How someone making ordinary wages nowadays would have had to start saving around the time of the Trojan War if they wanted to pile up as much as Jeff Bezos. Over the last 30 years, there have probably been 1,000 books on the downfall of the blue-collar middle class and the coming apart of this country, always with these titles, trying to convey maximum shock and alarm. There was a bestseller from 1991, and the title of it, you'll remember this, "America, What Went Wrong?" screamed the cover of the book. A few years later, the New York Times ran a series called The Downsizing of America. And since then, we have been swept over by a tsunami of learned laments on how the middle class has fallen behind, or any day now is going to erupt in anger. Books like Boiling Point, When Work Disappears, the unwinding, the global class war. And there's one, I love this title, America, Who Stole the Dream? 30 years of this stuff, folks, of writing and research, deterioration and despair, and still the authorities fail to put a stop to it. They have no solution for us. And I am here to ask, why the hell not? Where is our generation's Franklin Roosevelt, ready to remake this economy from top to bottom? Where is our Lyndon Johnson, ready to press the most far-reaching reforms through Congress? To start answering this question, we have to remember one of the few recent moments where our leaders actually seemed ready to step up to this task. It was in the year 2011, and it was in a speech by President Barack Obama mourning the eclipse of the middle-class society. Now, Obama gave that talk in, of all places, Osawatomie, Kansas, which is about 40 miles south of Kansas City. And it's a town that had been the home of the abolitionist John Brown, and later on the site of a famous speech by Teddy Roosevelt, in which he basically declared war on monopolies and big business. And then in 2011 comes Barack Obama to inscribe his own name on the Progressive Roll of Honor. And he started his talk that day in Osawatomie a lot like I just did, by describing the lost middle-class world, the one that his grandparents from Wichita had built and that his mom had grown up in. The society where people knew, as Obama put it, that if you gave it your all, you'd take home enough to raise your family and send your kids to school and have your health care covered, put a little away for retirement. But now things had changed, the president said, and we were living in a rerun of the 19th century. Obama talked about how jobs were being outsourced overseas or disappearing because of new technology. He talked about how tax cuts had made CEOs vastly more prosperous than their average line workers. And what's more, the president said, our political system itself was, quote, rigged, so that the rich could, in effect, buy whatever they wanted in Washington. For most Americans, the president went on, the basic bargain that made this country great has eroded. He continued, this is the defining issue of our time. This is a make or break moment for the middle class. I happen to agree with Barack Obama that this is the defining issue of our time. I mean, how could it not be? What he was talking about is, this is the dissolution of our way of life. But folks, defining the issue isn't enough. If you don't offer something better, your opponents are going to go about defining it in their own way, which, as you all know, is exactly what happened. The man who lifted Obama's line about what made this country great, of course, was a Republican, Donald Trump. And in his 2016 campaign, the loudmouthed billionaire stole the whole analysis laid out by Obama in his Osawatomie speech and cranked it up to maximum volume. He talked constantly about jobs being offshored, about the system being rigged by the rich, all the rest of it. He even went on to fantasize about making the Republicans into a, quote, workers' party. We all know what happened next. Of course, Trump won that whole tier of deindustrialized northern states where the bitterness at our various trade agreements runs so deep, and where society is coming apart, and where those deaths of despair that I described are in the newspaper every day, or they were in the newspaper every day until the local newspaper died as well. And those are Trump's people now. And then, of course, what did he do as president? Donald Trump gave the rich another big tax cut. He filled his cabinet with dedicated servants of this industry and that. He achieved new heights of deregulation. What I am describing here, folks, is the central paradox of American politics, and I'm here to tell you it's time we looked it in the face. The Republicans are a party that has historically worshipped big business, that has promised to do everything it can to smash workers' organizations and to protect the holdings of the wealthy from the clamoring of the low-born. And in the course of the last 40 years, the Republicans have ushered in a revolution in how we thought about economics. They cut taxes for the rich. They deliberately made it easy for manufacturing to move overseas. They rolled back regulations on nearly everything, as we all know. They allowed monopolies to start coming together again. If you want to know how that great society of 1965, how it died, well, this is how. This is the big new thing that the Republican Party brought to America. And now, here, you have this party getting returned to office by blue-collar Americans who have been spectacularly damaged by its signature ideas. This is the paradox of American politics, and we have to try to understand it. Now, I'm not going to bother tonight with the Republicans' own explanations for why they did all those things. And you've heard their claims. The market always knows best, they say. Monopolies are harmless. Unions are dangerous. Regulation doesn't work, and the rich simply must have tax cuts, right? I'm not going to bother with any of that because we now know that none of it is true. We also know that very few people vote for Republican candidates because they want their boss to have a McMansion, or because they want to go bankrupt paying for their health care, or because they hate the idea of clean food and pure water. So why has it happened? Well, there's two fairly accurate explanations that you often hear for why it's taking place, and they should be familiar to you. And the first is that the Republicans did all this not by persuasion, but by the power of money back in Washington, D.C. And the second is that Republicans win elections not by making economic arguments, but by stoking white voters' racial anxieties, by turning them against activist government, by reminding them that activist government does lots of things to help the minorities that they hate. And both of these explanations, by the way, are correct. They are correct descriptions of the politics of the last few decades, but they aren't the whole story. And the explanation I'm going to give you tonight is both, I think, scarier than what we usually hear, and also at the same time more hopeful. And it starts with the observation that Republicans, if you listen to them closely, Republicans often appeal to the left behind with the most democratic-sounding, egalitarian-sounding arguments. They don't tell us to be content with our lousy lot in life. No, you know what they do. They stoke people's fury, people's anger. They pose as defenders of the long-suffering silent majority, of the forgotten man. And the reason Republicans pretend to be populists is because this is a populist age, right? An age for defying authority and for hating the guy in charge. Republicans don't speak to us today like John D. Rockefeller or something, invoking the divine right of money or demanding that the lowly learn their place in the great chain of being. They do the opposite. They present themselves as enemies of the elite, as the voice of the unfairly persecuted, as a righteous protest of the people on history's receiving end. They're sitting right there on the couch with you as you watch some millionaire football player or Hollywood dandy insult your values and mock your patriotism on TV. Organized discontent, a right-wing leader used to say back in the 70s when all of this stuff was shocking and new. And folks, that is exactly what they do to this day. They love discontent. They stoke the flames. They provoke it constantly inventing new culture wars for you to get mad about. The war on Christmas, the war on Dr. Seuss, the endless complaints about TV news or public education, even the COVID pandemic. Every single one of them framed in the same way. Look at those arrogant liberal elites corrupting your innocent children or persecuting you for your humble folk ways. Now, what fascinates me, and if you've read any of my books, you know this, what fascinates me about these culture wars is that if you look closely at them, all of them, each one of them, is a mimicry of the historical left. The populist left, that's a Kansas word, by the way. You know, it was invented in this state, the word populism. The populist left, which long ago used to stand up for working people, accuse elites of lying to us via the news, arrogantly imposing their values on us, and so on. That was our team that did that. And the culture wars work because attacking those elites is a kind of imitation of the politics that we ought to have in this country. I mean, we should hate elites. Not school librarians, maybe, but CEOs, yes, certainly. Big tech, hell yes. The news media, absolutely. Hating them is a totally reasonable response to this world we're living in. The Republican Party knows this. And like good politicians, they use it, urging us to enlist in this endless fake class war that is so juicy, so entertaining. You know, it's all about you being persecuted by these distant, uncaring elites. This class war that never solves the problem. Next question is the obvious one. Why isn't it the Democrats that are organizing discontent? I know we're trying here in this room, right? But I'm talking about the larger National Democratic Party. Let's put Joe Biden and the current administration aside for a second and think back over the whole sweep of the free market decades. Why aren't the dispossessed working class people that I described turning in their time of need to the real thing, to the party of Roosevelt, the party that has done so much for them in the past, the party that built and defended the middle class civilization? For an answer to that question, I want to go back to Barack Obama's, again, to his famous speech in Osawatomie in 2011. It was this great, his great populist moment. This clearest of signals that the Democrats finally meant business on this matter of society's disintegration. Remember, he called it the defining issue of our time, correctly, and that the Democratic Party was prepared finally to do something about it. Well, what did Obama propose we do? He did not suggest that we use the federal government to fix the imbalance between corporate power and everybody else. He did not talk about smashing the monopolies that are choking workers and farmers in small towns. He didn't suggest ways to revitalize the labor movement. He didn't talk about renegotiating the trade agreements that have destroyed manufacturing in this country. Now, to be sure, these were all things that Barack Obama had talked about earlier in his life. But by 2011, they were all off the table. The way to solve our problems, Obama said on that day in Osawatomie, was to make education a national mission. We needed more people to go to college, since that was, as he put it, the surest route to the middle class. Americans needed to get new skills and training for our new high-tech age. We needed to get better at science and engineering. And once we did those things, Obama promised, then the world's CEOs would look upon America with favor again, and the jobs would start flowing back our way. Now, folks, there's a sense in which all of those things, it's just a platitude, right? Obviously, education. I'm here in Manhattan, Kansas. We all know this. Education's a good thing. None of us would have gotten very far in life if we didn't know how to read or do math. But as a solution for the make or break moment for the middle class, this is no answer at all. This is the opposite of an answer. What President Obama was saying is that there was no real problem with the economic structure of this country or of the world. The problem was with us. The middle class was collapsing because the middle class hadn't kept up. We didn't have the right credentials. We didn't have the right skills. We didn't study the right subjects. And we didn't get good enough grades. Let me be real blunt about this. This is not a way of confronting society's collapse. This is a way of rationalizing that collapse. As it happens, folks, a majority of Americans don't have and will never have a college degree. To tell them that this is the only thing that can save their world from disintegrating is to tell them that people like them basically have no claim to affluence in the first place. Oh, people who go to the right schools and study the right subjects and get the right grades, they deserve everything they get. But there is no longer any conceivable world in which unexceptional, rank-and-file humans get to enjoy middle-class prosperity. And that is the Democratic Party. The right is out there shrieking about the arrogance of elites, and the Democrats say you should have studied harder. Folks, they've got no real answer. And this is not theoretical, by the way. We don't have to speculate about it. We can look at the record. Barack Obama was president for 8 years. In the early days, Congress was entirely controlled by his party, and he got his education program passed, by the way. Standardized tests and charter schools from coast to coast. And his administration constantly talked up the idea of college as a, quote, investment. He also got a national health insurance program passed. So how did he do on inequality? How did he do on the defining issue of our time? Well, Obama's Justice Department never did prosecute any top executives on Wall Street. By the way, if you want to talk about an industry that has caused and profited from inequality, it's, of course, Wall Street. But they never managed to prosecute any of the top executives of that industry for the frauds that caused the financial crisis. Wall Street got bailed out repeatedly, again and again and again, and they got their bonuses right on schedule. Big Pharma did extraordinarily well in the Obama years, merging and acquiring and jacking up prices. The insurance industry enjoyed its greatest boom period of all time. Silicon Valley, which the Democrats back then regarded as something just short of sacred, Silicon Valley exploded in size as social media conquered the world. Universities constantly jacked up tuition and hired more and more administrators. And everybody else got austerity. Underwater homeowners got foreclosure. Workers got service jobs, the gig economy. Students got debt. Do the math, and here's what you find. There was tremendous economic growth in America during the recovery from the financial crisis, but somehow wages and salaries only increased by a tiny percent. Everything else went to shareholders. Under Obama's leadership, what economists call the labor share of the nation's GDP hit all-time lows, while the profit share hit all-time highs. And although it is hard to believe, life expectancy in the United States, which is one of the basic measures of the health of a civilization, actually started to go in reverse. Now I'm going to talk about some history here. I'm going to lighten things up. Okay, I'm not going to lighten it up. We're going to remain unremittingly negative for a while, but I promise you, we'll get to the happy stuff eventually. But let's remember before we go on the central questions that I'm asking here today. Why aren't our leaders doing something about the disintegration of the middle class? Why aren't the dispossessed turning en masse to the Democratic Party, the party of labor, the party of the Great Society? And you know the answer. It's because our modern day Democrats really aren't the party of labor and the Great Society any longer. I mean, the Democrats, they know about inequality. They've read books on it. They understand that it's bad. But somehow they can't bring themselves to do what is necessary to put things in reverse. Now, I know that the Republicans are worse. You don't have to convince me of this. They are tricksters and scoundrels and liars who would probably suspend elections altogether if they thought they could get away with it. But at least they pretend to be pissed off. Now, think about our Democratic leaders, some of whom consider the very word grievance to be a kind of joke. I mean, it's like they are incapable of outrage, always choosing as a leader some passionless technocrat in the mold of Jimmy Carter, Michael Dukakis, Al Gore, John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, someone with an amazing resume, but no real feeling for the ones whose lives are coming apart. And they go out there and they raise millions and millions of dollars from highly educated suburbanites who absolutely despise the other side. And then they hire some shadowy DC consultancy to run their campaign, and it's all done with computers and TV commercials, and the message is always the same. Those Republicans are just dreadful. And then when it's over and they've lost again, they blame the voters for rejecting their message. They say something's gone wrong with democracy itself. The consultants go off and bust unions for Amazon. The party leaders go to the Kennedy School or to their compound on Martha's Vineyard. And when the Democrats do happen to win, they come up with these massively complicated policy initiatives like Obamacare or Dodd-Frank that are impossible to understand and that somehow never achieve what they were designed to achieve. But the more complicated, the better, right? They're actually proud of this. Complexity is what makes these good policies. You know, A+ policies. You get a gold star from the teacher for that policy. If you look on the screen, you'll see a relic of a different Democratic Party. This is a relic from long ago during the Roosevelt-Truman days. It's an election flyer from a rural part of Texas, a state, and this is going to be hard for you to believe, but it's true, a state that used to produce fairly liberal Democrats, even though they weren't particularly Ivy League or anything like that. This flyer is very direct, very simple. Here is what our Democratic Party has given us, it reads, and then it lists the items very plainly. Rural electrification, telephones, roads, Social Security, agricultural price supports. Massive accomplishments, every single one of them. Things that changed the way Americans lived. Things that built the middle class, that made dirt farmers into prosperous citizens. Where did that Democratic Party go? You know, whatever happened to the party of the people? I think that the story of how the Democratic Party changed needs to be a part of how we think about the subject that I'm talking about today, the undoing of the affluent society. And here's what happened. In the late 1960s, roughly speaking, a big chunk of America's liberal commentariat basically convinced themselves that the problem with this country was white working class people who had crew cuts and supported the military and clung to their ugly cars and their suburban homes. The great liberal thinkers of the day were totally open about this. They simply no longer wanted to be associated with such unenlightened people. And if you study the history, you see this attitude in all sorts of different places. Democratic Party strategy books, best-selling works of pop sociology. It's in the movie Easy Rider, lots of other Hollywood movies of that period, hit TV shows. You remember Archie Bunker? Anyhow, as the years went by, this kind of high-minded revulsion against the primary constituency of the New Deal melded with a different but somehow related vision. And this is the idea that the liberalism of economic grievance was now obsolete in this advanced technological age. And all through the 1970s and 1980s, you had these new generations of politicians and commentators making the same claim over and over again, that the politics of social class needed to be abandoned. The Democrats, they would say, had to get right with globalization and become a tech-friendly party who were liberal on cultural issues, but who understood that the industrial society was dead and would stop trying to prop up manufacturing and the blue-collar way of life. Do you guys remember Gary Hart? ran for president in 1984 against, in the primaries against Walter Mondale. He was kind of the forerunner of all the Democrats that have come since then. And if you remember in the primaries how he kept attacking Walter Mondale, it was always for being too close to the AFL-CIO. Do you remember that? Constantly dinging him for being too close to quote-unquote big labor, but never dinging him for his closeness to any other interest group. I mean, Mondale was a liberal across the board, but constantly attacking him for being close to labor. So what the Democratic Party had to do, the enlightened people said, was go, you remember this phrase? Beyond left and right. They had to understand themselves as visionary new Democrats, a coalition of affluent, white-collar professionals, the ones whose economic standing is based on their credentialed academic achievement. Doctors, lawyers, pharmaceutical execs, the guys who write financial derivatives, the little phalanx of people who get paid to talk while the rest of us listen. That's the future of the Democratic Party, they would say. A party of winners, not losers. Here's a classic statement of this philosophy that I'm describing, the New Democrat philosophy. It comes from the year 1998. Quote, "The new economy favors a rising learning class over a declining working class." Right? And if the new economy favors that, learning class, then what the hell? And I guess the rest of us should too, right? Now, pause for a second and think about the language that I just read. A learning class. A class that owns learning, that is capable of enlightenment, as opposed to a class that merely works. Let's also think about the logic for a second. The suggestion that the Democratic Party should henceforth side with the winners in our economic system rather than the people whose lives the system was going to undermine. Now, folks, this was something genuinely new in history, that the left party in a two-party system is now siding with the well-to-do, that the left party is siding with the well-to-do. And I think this new thing was just as destructive to our society as the Republican Party's commitment to supply side, or whatever the hell they call it now. Anyhow, the guy that brought that big theory into practice was, of course, Bill Clinton, Rhodes Scholar, Yale Law graduate, the flower of the meritocracy, the living emanation of the learning class. Early on in his presidency, Clinton had this to say about the new economy. He said this, "The world we face today is the world where what you earn depends on what you can learn." This is one of his favorite phrases, right? Because it kind of rhymes. And he would go back to it again and again and again in the course of his presidency. And for him and for the great minds of his generation, this maxim about learning and earning was so true, it was almost holy. What you earn depends on what you learn. Hell yes, which is to say, you get what you deserve, and what you deserve is defined by how you did in school. Now, I think this phrase is the key to understanding what Clinton did as president and what the Democrats have done ever since. You remember what his first big achievement was. It was getting the North American Free Trade Agreement through Congress. It had been written by Republicans, but they couldn't get it passed. He got it done. Now, organized labor had worked really hard for Clinton's campaign, and they were against this because they knew that it would massively increase employers' bargaining power with their employees. You guys know how that works. So for the unions, NAFTA was a betrayal on this colossal scale. But for the New Democrats, NAFTA was an act of idealism. Every member of the learning class learned in Econ 101 that free trade was always and under all conditions for the best, always. And besides, those workers who are out there complaining, they hadn't done the learning, folks. They hadn't made the good grades. So perhaps it was right that they should lose power. And that those same stupid arguments, that same stupid consensus, that same contempt for working people would appear again and again and again with each of the era's trade agreements, climaxing with PNTR China in the year 2000, which incidentally did deindustrialize huge parts of the Midwest, specifically places that would years later flip sides for Donald Trump. Another way of thinking about the 90s, and I'll get off the 90s in a minute here, but we have to think about the 90s. Remember who Bill Clinton liberated, and remember who Bill Clinton clamped down on. His years in the White House, as you recall, was a golden age for deregulation. They deregulated telecom, they deregulated electric utilities, and of course the financial industry was deregulated again and again and again. There was a series of deregulatory measures, and it was like a long summer of corporate love in which the supposedly archaic restrictions of the New Deal were systematically overturned one after another, and these industries, all of them celebrated with this kind of whirlwind of mergers and buyouts and innovation and derivatives and mortgage-backed securities and energy trading investments. You know, it was a kind of post-industrial millennium, a white-collar age of Aquarius. But for other people, and at almost exactly the same time, Clinton signed off on some of the cruelest and most punitive measures of our lifetimes. I'm thinking of his welfare reform policy, which left single mothers to fend for themselves, and also of the notorious crime bill of 1994, which authorized the greatest imprisonment spree this country has ever seen. So you put these pieces together that I'm describing, and you start to understand the meaning of Clintonism. Those people whose earnings derived from learnings, they got trade deals. They got deregulation. They got freedom. What everybody else got was discipline. The learning class got the carrot, and everybody else got the stick. Now, folks, what made all this monumental was who did it. These were deeds of the Democratic Party, the traditional friend of unions and minorities and the traditional enemy of Wall Street and the rich, all of which had now been stood on its head. When Republicans cut taxes or deregulate banks, that's one thing, right? That's what we expect. When Democrats do it, that is something fundamentally different. That is the shifting of the tectonic plates of politics. That is the opposition ceasing to oppose. And then, 8 years later, an amazing wave of white-collar fraud, and our deregulated financial system has to be rescued in its entirety. Another idealistic, high-achieving new Democrat gets the job. And what happens? You know, the learning class. They get a bailout. They get a bonus. They get a get-out-of-jail-free card. Why do our modern Democrats keep doing things like this? Why do some of us get ruination, but Wall Street, Big Pharma, and Silicon Valley, they get whatever they want, endless second chances? Is it just because it's that's the law of economics? Nothing can be done? No. I'm here to suggest that it happens for the simplest reason. It's because the Democrats today are a class party, and that the class that they serve is not us. It is, as their own manifestos tell us, the learning class. Now look, I know that there's a lot of good Democrats out there. I don't want you to get the wrong message, okay? There's some good Democrats right here in this room. And I am a huge fan of Sherrod Brown, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, even Joe Biden about 50% of the time, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the people who staffed the last two Democratic administrations were different. They would look at those knowledge industries and they would see classmates, people of sophisticated jargon and extraordinary innovativeness, exactly the sort of creative individuals that Democratic Party theory tells us we must honor and respect, right? We must declare access to Facebook to be a universal human right, which our State Department actually did. We must make the world safe for Pfizer. Let's talk about what this new liberalism looks like on the ground. And there's a little bit of memoir here, but when I first became politically aware back in the 1980s, the Republican Party, do you remember this? The Republican Party used to massively outspend the Democrats in every election, often by many times. Today, after all the changes I've described, the situation is quite different. In fundraising terms, Hillary Clinton wiped the floor with the billionaire Trump, outspending him almost 2-to-1. After the election was over, Clinton looked back over the debacle and boasted that the places that voted for her represented the country's most, quote, dynamic areas, locales that between them represent 2/3 of America's GDP. In 2020, Joe Biden did even better than that. According to a survey by the Brookings Institute, the counties he won account for 71% of America's economic activity. Trump country, just 29. Of America's 100 best educated counties, the Wall Street Journal tells us the Democrat Biden won 84. Of the 100 counties with the highest median income, Biden won 57. When I was a kid, Republicans prevailed easily in both of those categories. Now, as it happens, I grew up in one of the places that this data describes, Johnson County, Kansas, home of the white-collar suburbs of Kansas City. Now, although my family was not particularly well-to-do, Johnson County is, as you know, by far the richest county in the state of Kansas, a place of successful professionals, first-rate public schools, tidy little office parks, and endless mansionization. And when I was younger and the punk rock soundtrack would play constantly in my car, my friends and I would drive Johnson County's winding roads and its dainty little cul-de-sacs, sneering at the bourgeois pretentiousness of the place. Folks, we sneered because those people were the ruling class. Johnson County was rich, it was white, it was in charge, and it was Republican. And when I would go to the polling place in our creamy little corner of Johnson County, the election officials would have this thick printout of registered Republican voters, and the corresponding document for Democrats was just a page. I know, because I was on that page, right? And I once looked it up. Johnson County had not chosen a Democrat for president since the year 1916, over a century ago. Well, you know what happens next, right? In November 2020, Johnson County finally gave it up and voted for the Democrat. One of only 5 counties in the state of Kansas to do that. Now, the essential relationships there have not changed in any way. Johnson County is still overwhelmingly white. It is still intensely corporate. The kids still go to good schools. The real estate values are still high. And Johnson County still lords it over the sweating masses of the region. But it does so now from the left, at least as we use that term in America. So you get the story that I'm telling here. It is a story of cosmic reversal, of how American liberalism went from being a blue-collar credo to being a philosophy of learning class winners. This is a momentous change. It's a new thing in history since the start of mass democracy in the mid-19th century. And here's what I want to ask. What happens to a country when the people its left party speaks for are the people on top? What happens to a country when that's the situation? Now, I've already described the material consequences. Economic power disappears from the political agenda. You get skyrocketing inequality with everything brushed off as the result of education. You get deindustrialization, massive indebtedness, declining public health. Society deteriorates. Culture wars are everything. Culture wars are everywhere. Liberalism, meanwhile, and we want to start getting the second slide ready here. Liberalism gets reimagined as a kind of marker of, oh, there it is, a marker of personal virtue. It's not about achieving big things for all Americans. It's about telling the world what a well-educated and saintly person you are. It's a way of advertising your standing in the social hierarchy, where the people on top are the moral ones, the enlightened ones, and the lower orders are bigoted deplorables. You remember these signs, the anti-Trump signs. In this house we believe, and they go on, and you see them a lot. You saw a lot of them in Johnson County, and you see. I live in Bethesda, Maryland these days. They were all over the place in all of these sort of wealthy, highly educated places, and you see the idea of the sign is to include every liberal cause, and Black Lives Matter, women's rights are human rights, no human is illegal, science is real, love is love. And kindness is everything. And these are all things I agree with. These are all great causes. But ask yourself, what is missing from this sign? They've overlooked the bank bailouts. They've overlooked monopoly power. They've overlooked the right to organize, affordable housing, affordable health care, and on down the list. Every single one of the items that I really care about. So, okay, you can turn it off now. I'm done making fun of the yard sign. Another thing that happens when the traditional left disappears is that a crucial space on the board is left vacant. When you take all those causes off the yard sign, there's something that's left vacant. There's a hole. You remember in the 80s when we studied critical theory, there's a lacuna, they would say. And everybody goes out there and tries to claim that space for themselves. They try to fill that lacuna. And you see these fake lefts cropping up everywhere in our culture. People trying to fill that empty space. Soda pops identify themselves with the human struggle for liberation. Management theorists claim that they are warriors for economic justice. Entrepreneurs say that they are activists. Day traders say they are rebels against the Wall Street banks. The Wall Street banks say they're rebels against the racist patriarchy. And of course, the Republican Party, they're also a rebel, right? In their case, against all of these other liberal elites, these bankers and campus activists and advertising men. Guys like Josh Hawley come out and tell us that they are the true allies of the downtrodden, right? And the Republicans are the party of the horny-handed sons of toil. And we laugh, but let's face it, they've had a lot of success in their outreach to anxious working-class voters. A success, I would say, that is precisely equal to the degree to which liberalism has abandoned those same voters. Every time one of our Democratic leaders goes out and tells an audience of union members that they have to have a college degree if they want to stay in the middle class, they made converts to Trumpism. So as Democrats increasingly embraced the credentialed elite, Republicans cast themselves in ever more florid tones as pork rind eating salt of the earth. And into this fake, folksy buzzsaw, our clueless Dems walked again and again. So here's where we Americans find ourselves in this moment of unending crisis. Our two-party system has degenerated into a hate game of culture war played in the long, dim hallways of untreated persecution mania. Both sides believe that the system is rigged against them. Both of them see their opponents as the puppets of powerful elites. Both revile the other side as traitors, as Nazis, as would-be dictators. Both long to force the other to shut their trap. Both see democracies collapse just around the corner. And with the help of carefully framed news stimulus, both can be brought to instant hysteria. I mean, today we are riding the carousel of outrage, courtesy of Fox News, CNN, and Twitter, and we just can't get off. Folks, there has got to be a way out of this. Now look, I think we all know, all of us here in this room know what has to happen. The overwhelming defeat of the Republican Party. We know that. These are the guys who are responsible for dragging our politics to such an awful place. The Republicans are the ones who originally invented all of the disastrous economic arrangements that I've described. And today, those guys in Washington openly rejoice in preventing this country from solving its problems. So the Republicans must be beaten. I mean overwhelmingly. I mean Franklin Roosevelt style. Unfortunately, the Democratic Party as it currently stands is not up to that challenge. I was going to say this, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. Folks, Clintonism cannot stop the fascist juggernaut. So we have to change the Democratic Party. You want to beat the Republicans, we have to change the Democratic Party. By which I do not mean reaching out to Liz Cheney or excommunicating everyone who doesn't use the correct academic language. The way we do it is by building a movement. Now, I want to remind you of something so obvious, so clear to me, that nobody in Washington, D.C. knows. There are things a party of the left can do to win working class voters. Really? Yeah. Remember that flyer that I showed you from Texas farm country back in the day? Democrats used to win the ancestors of the Trump voters all the time. Even here in Kansas, they beat the Republicans regularly for 50 years, overwhelmingly beat them. They built the middle class. They got the civil rights laws passed. They made sure that ordinary people could retire. All those great, great, great things. And we can do that stuff again. But the first step is changing the way we think about who we are and how we got to this sorry place. Look, folks, we don't have to understand America as a reprehensible land or its people as irredeemably wicked. We don't have to be joyless Pharisees offering up a politics of scolding. It's flattering, I know, it's flattering to we the enlightened, but it's not how you build a social movement. Now, the good news here, I think, is that our current president, to some degree, actually gets what I'm saying. If he was here in the room, he'd probably agree with me a little bit. I mean, Biden seems to understand that it's a fight to win over ordinary Americans, not Ivy League, professors or something. And he's done good things on antitrust enforcement. He has left austerity long behind. He at least, understands the problem of student debt. Don't know if he's done the right thing about it, but he understands the problem. And he may also be the most pro-labor president we've had in many years. And look at what's happening around the country. People are finally organizing at places like Starbucks, at Amazon, at Trader Joe's. Now, this is not to say I wholeheartedly endorse the guy or anything. He's also handed huge government contracts to Amazon, and he loves to fantasize about getting along with old school Republicans. And his cabinet is made up of the usual bunch of passionless technocrats, the same guys as always. But regardless of how good or bad Joe Biden turns out to be, it's not about him. It is about us. It is about building a reform movement that sweeps everything before it, which has happened before in this state, by the way. How do you do it? There's a guy called Lawrence Goodwin. He was from Texas, veteran of the civil rights movement. And later in life wrote the authoritative book on the populist movement, a movement that's got its start right here. And he was, through his activism and through his study, became an expert on how democratic political movements come together and how they triumph. And he had an answer to our question. What they should never do, he wrote, was embrace the politics of individual righteousness, in which you celebrate the purity of your radicalism. If what you want to do is to change America's actual distribution of economic power, Goodwin wrote, you must practice what he called ideological patience, a suspension of moral judgment of ordinary people. Only then can you build a mass movement that is hopeful and powerful and changes society forever. The reason Larry Goodwin said that was because he knew that every successful democratic movement in our past consisted not of people with advanced degrees fastening their professional consensus down on the world, but of ordinary people from different races and religions coming together to advance their collective interests. Well, that doesn't exactly conform to the contemporary view. Those ordinary people that Goodwin admired have by definition not learned the academic jargon of critical theory. They often have very traditional religious and cultural views. They are, to use a modern term, problematic. And yet one thing I have learned in the course of my stupid life is that you don't have to be a person of unblemished moral virtue to do good things. Our ancestors were sinners, every single one of them morally inadequate, and still they built this country. In a democracy, imperfect humans are the basis of everything. There is no way around this. And if we build a movement in which such people are invited to work together to advance widely shared interests, all things become possible. If we offer them nothing but scolding, we are lost. Look at us today. We liberals are intoxicated with our moral purity. We are determined to root out ideological heresy. We don't build movements these days, we purge them, canceling and scolding and deplatforming, whittling down the ranks to an ever tinier core of the righteous. We don't get things done by mobilizing the people. We get them done by mobilizing the CEOs, getting them to declare capital strikes against cities and states for their offenses against liberalism. Ask yourself, is there any variety of left politics that is capable of addition rather than subtraction, of bringing together Americans from every ancestry, every sex, every religion, instead of driving them apart? And you know there is. And surprise, it's the very same liberalism that we leave off the yard signs. The very same liberalism that 50 years of Democratic Party thinkers told us we shouldn't care about any longer, because its traditional bearers were these vulgar, uneducated hard hats, or because globalization, in the brilliance of its futurific wisdom, had consigned it all to history's dustbin. I'm talking about economic democracy. Yes, and I know it is corny to care about things like this, and maybe I'm a sap to be sentimental about the populists and the New Deal and the Great Society, and yet it's a funny thing, folks. A lot of us are saps in exactly that way. You go down the list of issues having to do with universal shared prosperity, and here's what you will find. Most of them get overwhelming approval from the public. An enormous majority of Americans wants affordable health care and affordable housing. An enormous majority wants secure retirement. An enormous majority thinks the minimum wage ought to be higher. You frame the questions that face us in a different way, and suddenly you find that the very physics of politics have changed. Suddenly we are talking about enormous majorities for liberalism, not another disaster at the hands of this year's bigot. It all reminds me of the remarks of Bayard Rustin. You remember this guy, the supreme strategist of the civil rights movement, as he was watching a decade of progress grind to a halt in the early 1970s. The potential for a Republican majority, he wrote, depends on Richard Nixon's success in attracting into the conservative fold lower middle-class whites, the same group that the liberal New Politics has written off. The question is not whether this group is liberal or conservative, for it is both. And how it acts will depend upon the way the issues are defined. Define those issues as culture war or racial conflict, and the conservatives will win. But if they are defined so as to appeal to the progressive economic interests of the lower middle class, then it becomes possible to build an alliance on the basis of common interest between this group and the black community. Well, the liberals didn't listen to Bayard Rustin in those days, and they chose white-collar virtue over building a broad social movement. And the liberals still don't listen, right down to the present day. Well, it's time they woke up. And as it happens, there is an even more direct way of putting the question, one that I draw from a book about politics written in the hopeful year of 1936. Here's the question: for whom does America exist? Well, what's the answer we give today? For whom does this country exist? It's billionaires? It's celebrities? It's tech companies? Are we the people nothing more than a working, sweating instrument for the jackpot paydays of our betters, sending them up into space? Are we just ready-made suckers for the next Enron, the next Lehman Brothers? Are we just pawns for the, foreign policy community, as they call themselves back in Washington? A chess set that with which they get to play the great game of imperialism? Are we just glorified security guards dutifully protecting their holdings? Are we just a vast test market to be tracked and probed and surveilled and sold on fast food and cheap electronics and Hollywood movies? Or is it the other way around? Are they supposed to serve us? I want us to resolve to ask that far-reaching question again. For whom does America exist? This time around, there can be only one possible answer. Thank you very much, folks.